thank you all very much for coming in such large numbers. I'm very pleased and honored to be here, and I would like to express my thanks to the organizers for the invitation and all the arrangements. Okay, I was first approached to give these lectures on the topic of applied cognitive linguistics. So perhaps I should begin by issuing a warning. I am not an applied linguist. I am not going to deal with how to teach languages. That's not my business, and I actually don't really have very much to say about that. The focus will be very much theoretical and linguistic, however, with an eye on the question, what is the use of all this to the language teaching profession? I say language teaching profession rather than simply language teachers, because the language teaching profession includes a lot more than simply the classroom teachers. It includes the administrators, the textbook writers, the examiners, people who assess proficiency and all that. So language teaching as such is actually quite a large industry and involves much more than simply the language teachers. As I say, there are the curriculum planners, the administrators, the testers, the textbook writers, the material producers, and all those sorts of things. Now, a few words actually to begin with on what I see as the relation between the language teaching profession on the one hand and linguistics on the other. There are people who would say that language teachers don't in fact need to know anything about linguistics. Their job is to teach the language. It is not to teach about the language. So you are teaching people to speak and to read and so on. You are not teaching them linguistics as such. You are not teaching them grammar as such. All you are teaching them or trying to teach them is a skill in the foreign language. And I guess I do know in my personal experience lots of quite effective language teachers who in fact, well, exaggerating a little, don't know the difference between a noun and a verb. In other words, language teachers who actually know very, very little about linguistics. But nevertheless, they're quite effective. And as I say, the argument would go, or the point of view would be that to teach a language, you need teaching skills. You don't need to know about the language. And certainly you don't have to teach about the language. Well, this might be true for some individuals, but I would still like to think that if you're teaching something, you need to know something about what it is that you are teaching. In other words, to be an effective English teacher, it's not enough simply to be able to speak the language, even if you are very proficient, even if indeed you are a native speaker of the language. That is not enough to guarantee success as a teacher. I think we would agree with that. Again, I would also come back to what I said earlier, that the language teaching profession is much more than simply classroom teachers. It's also, as I say, the textbook writers and the curriculum planners and all those sorts of people. And there's another point I would like to make, and I'll develop this probably tomorrow, is that even if you do not have any specialized linguistic knowledge, whenever you start to teach language, or if you are engaged in, say, writing materials or assessing proficiency, you necessarily draw on some theory of language, even if it is not a conscious one, even if it is not an expert scientific theory. In other words, everybody has ideas about language, and these ideas may be based on what I'll call a folk theory of language, which might not be the expert or the professional or the academic theory of language. So you can't get away from theory, right? Whether you like it or not. Given that, it's obviously a good idea that the theory that you base your practice and activities on is a good theory. And I guess I am prejudiced to this, but I would like to think that cognitive linguistics is a good theory of language and a suitable theory for basing language description, language teaching, and so on. Okay, so that then very much by way of introduction. Today I want to say a few words about what cognitive linguistics is. It's a very broad term and it includes quite a lot of different approaches. I also want to put it into some kind of historical perspective, certainly within the perspective of sort of Western, if you like, academic linguistics of the last century or so. Then I'll go on to make some suggestions as to why all this might be relevant to the language teaching profession and what the implications of this might be. Okay, so that's very general. So what I want to talk about today this morning, are these three questions. First of all, what is cognitive linguistics? What are its main features? What are its main characteristics? What are the main topics? What are the main assumptions of cognitive linguistics? What is cognitive linguistics? This term which is much used. And, what is cognitive linguistics? Secondly, what are its main features? What are the main topics? And thirdly, why should this be of interest to the language teaching profession? And are there any conclusions or implications of this for language teaching and language learning? Okay. Sorry. Okay. First of all, as a characterization of cognitive linguistics, this is a quotation from the editorial statement of a monograph series, a book series, Cognitive Linguistics Research, published by Mutten de Gruyter in Berlin. I'm one of the editors of this series, and I'm partially responsible for the content. The other editors were, Lanneker and René Derven. Okay, this is a very broad statement of what cognitive linguistics is. So cognitive linguistics subsumes or includes a variety of concerns and broadly compatible theoretical approaches. In other words, cognitive linguistics is not a single theory. It is a group, it's an approach, a general approach to the study of language which includes a number of more specific concerns and theories. So cognitive linguistics subsumes a variety of concerns and broadly compatible theoretical approaches that have a common basic outlook. So what unifies these is the belief or the assumption that language is an integral facet of cognition. In other words, this is the cognitive. Language is here, basically. It's in the head, it's in the mind, it's in the brain. So it's an integral facet of cognition. So it is one of the, first of all, it is a cognitive activity, and it is related or integrated with other cognitive facilities that we have. Thinking, reasoning, perception, and so on. So it's an integral facet of cognition which reflects the interaction of, so a number of things come together, the social, cultural, psychological, communicative and functional considerations. So social, language is clearly social, involves relations between people. Cultural, it is the product of cultural development. Psychological, it is a personal thing, it resides in individual minds. And communicative, we use language to communicate ideas. And functional considerations, that is, we use language to do things. Language has a purpose. You use language to persuade people, to manipulate people, to deceive people, etc. So there are functional considerations. So all these things can only be understood in the context of a realistic view of, so this is the general thing, what cognitive linguistics is about. It has to be understood in the context of a realistic view of acquisition. It is, this is not a very profound statement, but it's a very important one, that language has to be acquired by individuals. You are not born with a language. You have to learn it in the first years of life. And how does this learning, how does this acquisition process occur is a very fundamental question. But the study of language has to be, you have to study language with an eye on the question, how could people possibly acquire this? So a realistic view of acquisition, cognitive development, as language develops in the child alongside other cognitive skills, and mental processing, that is a psychological activity. It's an activity, things happen in the brain. So language is represented in the brain, it has to be processed, it has to be stored, it has to be processed in the activities of speaking and listening and so on. The word realistic here, that of course is polemical. It is critical of something, namely the Chomskyan approach to acquisition. There's an understood polemical opposition here. The implication would be that Chomskyan views of acquisition are not realistic. Okay. It seeks, insofar as possible, to explicate language structure, that is grammar if you like, in terms of other facets of cognition on which it draws. In other words, there's the attempt to see grammar and the way languages are structured actually in terms of something else, in terms of what they mean, for example, in terms of their function. So other facets of cognition on which it draws, as well as the communicative function it serves. Okay, so you have then a very broad statement of what cognitive linguistics is. So it is not a theory. It's not even an approach. It's a kind of collection of approaches, a set of approaches with some very broad unifying assumptions. That perhaps the most important one is that language is related, integrated with other cognitive and social activities and abilities. Okay. I'd like to put this in some more context. There are possibly three approaches, if you like, to the study of language. Three views on what language is, if you like. One approach is to say that language is not mental, language is not cognitive, language is behavior. Language is what you do. It's something that people do, and language is simply observable behavior. So the study of language, the study of linguistics, is simply studying what people say. This is an approach, within the sort of Western linguistic tradition. This, of course, is the approach that was characteristic, especially of North American linguistics in the 30s and 40s and up to the 50s, so-called Bloomfieldian linguistics, behaviorism, in fact, that language was simply behavior. So to do linguistics meant you went out with your tape recorder. You didn't have tape recorders in those days. You went out with your notebook and you made transcriptions of what people said. You had your corpus of transcriptions, and that was the language. Doing linguistics was simply looking at these, classifying them, writing grammars, identifying phonemes, identifying morphemes, and so on and so forth. So language was a behavior, and you were not allowed to make reference to what people thought. You are not allowed to make reference to meaning, because meaning is not observable. You can't observe meaning. All you can observe is what people do. What goes inside the head is invisible. That is of no concern to us. Okay? So a language is a kind of behavior associated, as I say, especially with North American linguistics in the 30s and 40s and up to the 50s. It's also an approach, of course, which underlies quite a lot of sociolinguistic research even now, where you simply count your variables and how many times people use this sound rather than that sound, or this word rather than that word. So the emphasis very much on collecting data, analyzing it, making no reference to what people think or whatever. The second view needs a bit of explanation. Language is a Platonic object. This is a reference to the Greek philosopher Plato of 2,500 years ago, who believed that there were abstract ideas floating around independent of us. So the idea here that language, let us say the English language, sort of exists out there, independent of its speakers, and all speakers do, they have access to a part of it. It's like saying that the English language exists in a dictionary and the grammar book. Right? So it exists independent of its speakers. Some speakers might know a lot of it, some speakers might know a little bit of it, some people might have an imprecise or an incorrect view of it, but the idea is that the language exists as an object independent of its speakers. Okay? That is an approach which is characteristic actually of many logical approaches, mathematical approaches to language. So a language is studied as rather like a mathematical system with no reference to its speakers. Okay. So we won't be too much concerned with that. The third approach is that language is a mental phenomenon, that is, it exists in the minds and brains of its speakers. Now notice that by saying that language is a mental phenomenon, that does not deny that language is also has a social component. Of course you use language in social interaction, and there are norms of and there are norms for social interaction, norms for using language in interpersonal situations, but those norms have to be learned. You have to know what you are supposed to say in certain situations, and that knowledge is, of course, mental. So by saying that language is a cognitive phenomenon does not deny that it is also a social phenomenon, because the social aspects of language also have to be learned, and you have to know what they are. Just as you have to know the grammar, you also have to know the sociolinguistic norms for using the language. And those are mental, they are cognitive, they have to be learned somehow, and they are utilized in the actual process of speaking and communication and so on. Okay, so that's the way. Now, the cognitive in cognitive linguistics, again, putting this into its sort of historical perspective from a Western point of view, it was, of course, Chomsky who did this. There's a bit of linguistic history, as I say, in North American linguistics, not so much European linguistics, that was different, their traditions were different. European linguistics had been, and still is to some extent, concerned with philology, that is the study of texts, the study of the history of languages. So if you do English linguistics or linguistics in a European university, an essential component is the history of the language, the histories of the language, and an essential component of doing English is reading Old English and Beowulf and all that stuff. So European linguistics I'm generalizing, but has tended to have this historical, philological emphasis. But say North American linguistics in the 30s and 40s, 50s of the last century was behaviorist. The focus was on describing languages, especially unknown languages, undescribed American Indian languages, and so on and so forth. So it was behaviorist. The emphasis was on collecting data and analyzing, classifying data. Then Chomsky's achievement in the 50s and 60s was to turn the focus away from the emphasis on collecting and analyzing data onto the cognitive aspect of language. So he emphasized the fact, he made the point that language is not simply a collection of texts. Language is something that speakers know. It resides in the mind, and the text, what people say, that is simply the consequence of knowledge, of the linguistic knowledge that you have. So linguistics has got to be concerned with how is linguistic knowledge represented in the mind. So it's not just a question of what you say, what people say, but how is that knowledge, how is the underlying knowledge represented in the mind? Now, of course, you can't answer that question directly. All you can do is speculate, and of course, this is where so the study of syntax, the study of grammar becomes, as I point out here, the grammar, the grammatical description that you have, that you come up with, is a hypothesis about the cognitive representation of a language. So whenever even on a very basic level, whenever you talk about things like nouns and verbs, which are pretty basic concepts in linguistics, nouns and verbs do not exist in the speech signal. If you observe what people say, you cannot see nouns and verbs there. nouns and verbs are abstract concepts. You need nouns and verbs to describe language, and given the cognitive turn, you would have to say that nouns and verbs are somehow that the notion of a noun and a verb is somehow relevant to the cognitive representation of a language. So, how is linguistic knowledge represented in the mind, and the grammar that you come up with, the description of a language that you come up with, is a hypothesis about the cognitive representation. And the second question is, how do you get this knowledge? How is it acquired? And thirdly, how is it put to use? Okay. Let's see. Now, Now, these three questions, or the cognitive turn, the emphasis on language as a cognitive phenomenon, that, of course, is something that probably nowadays most linguists would agree with. So in a sense, Chomsky is a cognitive linguist from this point of view. This basic assumption, yeah, no doubt about that. But if you like, okay, it sounds rather arrogant to say where Chomsky went wrong, but given the belief or the assumption that language is a cognitive phenomenon, there are a number of ways in which you can develop this idea. Now, Chomskyan linguistics was based on a number of assumptions about the mind. It was based on these assumptions, and cognitive linguistics actually then reinforced the assumptions, so they became facts rather than assumptions. And one of the assumptions was that the mind is modular. What this means is, well, you can draw an analogy between the mind and the body. So the human body consists of parts. Different parts of the body have different functions, they have different structures. The liver does one kind of system, is independent of the functioning of the liver, for example. I think we can accept that as given. So just as the human body consists of parts, different organs have different functions, different structures, they develop in different ways, and each organ and organs might have their own individual, disorders, which are to some extent independent. So the mind is modular. That is, the idea would be that different cognitive abilities are, in a sense, independent. So language is one such cognitive ability, which is independent of social abilities, interpersonal skills. So knowledge of a language is independent of your ability to interact with people, right? Which is independent of your knowledge of the world, which is independent of your ability at mathematics. So mathematical ability would be separate. Musical ability would be separate. So the idea that there are all sorts of different abilities, different skills, I say mathematical ability, musical ability, social ability, ability to get on with people, and so on, knowledge of the world, your ability to reason logically, and so on. These will be independent skills, and language knowledge of the grammar of a language will also be independent of these in principle. Of course, they all interact. In other words, to interact with somebody, you need your social skills, and you need the language in order to do this. But the two skills are in principle independent, and you can be good at one and not very good at the other, put it this way. Or you can lose one without losing the other. Of course, this also ties up with arguments about the nature of intelligence. Is intelligence a unified phenomenon, or rather components of intelligence, like, as I say, verbal intelligence, mathematical intelligence, and so on. It's a controversial area. But anyway, but the Chomsky assumption was that the mind is modular with the independent components. And also it was assumed that the child or the infant comes into the world with a brain which has a rich initial structure. In other words, the mind at birth and before birth is not blank. There's a ritual structure which determines its future development. Given these assumptions, which are quite plausible, a number of things follow, and these are some of the characteristics of Chomskyan linguistics. I'm doing this because, to a certain extent, cognitive linguistics, as we know it, arose or developed in the sort of 1980s and 90s in opposition to Chomskyan linguistics. So cognitive linguistics has a kind of, or initially at least, it has a kind of polemical component. It saw itself in opposition to something. So what I'm doing here is giving an outline of what it was that cognitive linguistics was opposing, if you like. Okay, so again, developing the notion of modularity, there is, as I explained, the idea that linguistic knowledge is distinct from conceptual knowledge, social cognition, interpersonal skills, abilities to reason, and so on and so forth. But another crucial component of Chomskyan linguistics is that language knowledge itself consists of modules which interact in various ways, and some of the modules will be familiar to you. If you look at textbooks of Chomskyan grammars, you have these little boxes: syntax, morphology, phonology, and arrows and lines connecting them. So the syntax is one component, the morphology is another one, the lexicon is another one, phonology is another one, and so on. So the idea that linguistic knowledge itself consists of independent, though interacting modules. So syntax, morphology, phonology are separate components of the grammar with their own principles and their own organization. And syntax itself breaks down into various principles. I won't bore you with the stuff, but if you've done Chomskyan linguistics, you'll know all about X-bar principles and theta principles. Sorry, LE. And all the rest of it, okay? So the idea would be then that the grammar can then be described in terms of these principles, independent but interacting. Now, taking these approaches, pursuing these approaches, you end up with a kind of linguistics which is very abstract and very algebraic, actually. It looks like mathematics or algebra rather than language. And there are some unfortunate byproducts, some perhaps unintended consequences of this approach, and perhaps one of the most disturbing and one of the most problematic is that Chomskyan linguistics makes a distinction, if not explicitly, well, yeah, it is, Chomsky does make it explicitly, between the core of a language and the periphery, that is, the central part and all the not so important parts. So the core part of the grammar would be those essential, some very general aspects of syntactic structure. The periphery would be all the exceptions and the idioms and so on. So if you look at Chomskyan, any book on Chomskyan linguistics, one thing that immediately strikes you is the kind of data that they look at, the kind of sentences that they talk about. Sentences which no one would actually say, involving a very limited vocabulary and a very small number of phenomena, usually involving WH questions and relative clauses and anyway, very impoverished range of data, but which are supposed to illustrate core phenomena such as WH movement and all the rest of it. But the periphery, the idiomatic, the idiosyncratic, the exceptional, especially words, lexical items, phrases, and so on, these are hardly discussed at all. Prepositions, for example, are discussed only to the extent that they feature in very general syntactic rules. You won't find in any Chomskyan account of English any detailed description of what prepositions mean and how they are used in idiomatic phrases and so on and so forth. So there's a distinction between the core and the periphery, and in fact paradoxically, Chomskyan linguistics seems to deal with peripheral aspects of language as if they were central, but the important things in language are in fact put at the periphery. So there's a kind of, strange view as to what is essential and what is not so essential. Okay, so that is the point that emerges if you look through, if you browse in any Chomskyan text, the strange data that is cited and the fact that the data, the example sentences which are cited, don't really seem to deal with the interesting things in a language. And the second point is an over-reliance on intuition and invented data. This relates to the first point. If you look at the examples discussed in Chomskyan texts, the example sentences are very often invented by the linguist. They are marked with asterisks and question marks and so on, judgments as to whether they are grammatical or not. And there is a general neglect of actual linguistic data, so a complete reversal from the previous behaviorist tradition. A third point, again this is getting a bit technical. If you don't know what I'm talking about here, never mind. But if you've done any Chomskyan linguistics, you'll know what I'm talking about. In the generative and syntactic analysis, there are all sorts of invisible elements, invisible or rather inaudible things. Invisible NPs and invisible heads and all that sort of thing. So things which are postulated in the structure but which have no overt manifestation. And all sorts of processes which are invisible, like things moving around and so on and so forth. You can't observe things moving around in the sentence as you speak it or read it. Okay, so if you don't know what I'm talking about, that doesn't matter. But let's say if you've done Chomskyan linguistics, you'll know very well what I'm talking about. And the fourth characteristic is almost general neglect of semantics. There's virtually nothing. Well, that's actually not true. Semantics is mentioned, but only certain aspects of semantics, particularly the relation between a verb and its arguments. That certainly is mentioned. But all the nitty-gritty aspects of what words actually mean and how, word combinations are interpreted, this is very much neglected. So a general neglect of semantics. You won't find very much on polysemy, for example, in Chomskyan linguistics. Okay, so cognitive linguistics, as we're talking about here. So what's happened now? Yeah, Chomskyan cognitive linguistics, as we're talking about it here, emerged in the late 1980s and 1990s, largely as a reaction to some characteristics, some of the excesses of the Chomskyan and related approaches, and the important events, the two key events, both in 1987, Lanneker's Foundations of Cognitive Grammar and Lakoff's Women, Fire and Dangerous Things. So Lanneker was developing a theory of cognitive grammar, which was quite independent, quite different in many important respects from the Chomskyan approach. And Lakoff, of course, put the emphasis on categories and categorization. And a number of other individuals, of course, are also important from this period, who I won't go into. Okay, now, some guiding principles of cognitive linguistics. As I indicated earlier, the term cognitive linguistics actually could be confusing because in a certain respect, Chomsky and the Chomskyans are cognitive linguists. But from now on, I'll be using cognitive linguistics in a narrower sense to refer to the kind of linguistics associated with Laneke, Lakoff. What that means is a very simple or a very self-evident notion that language, a word or expression, a phrase, a sentence, relates two things. On the one hand, there is the word, the expression or whatever in its perceptible form, that is as sound or as writing, and there is the meaning which it expresses. So I say a very basic notion that language relates sound and meaning, or if you like, writing and meaning if you're looking at a written language, or in the case of a signed language, gesture and meaning. So, a very simple case, a word has a pronunciation, the sound, and it has a meaning. It's a very basic, a very obvious, even banal statement. Now, Laneke takes this as the basic assumption of his linguistics. So you take a very simple idea, language is symbolic, it relates sound and meaning, and you make that the foundation of your whole theory. And he puts this right at the beginning of his book: language is symbolic in nature. It makes available to the speaker, or writer, or whatever, or hearer, for either personal or communicative use, an open-ended set of signs or expressions, each of which associates a semantic representation of some kind with a phonological representation of some kind. Okay, now, this means, quite simply, that a language relates, or that the individual units, expressions in a language, relate a meaning or conceptualization with some kind of observable form, which could be acoustic, signed, written. Okay. So that is a very simple notion, but I think if you take that and develop it, all sorts of interesting things follow. Okay, so I'll develop this in a moment. So the guiding assumption, or guiding principles, language is symbolic in nature. It is not a mathematical system, right? For combining, it's not a system for combining elements. It is symbolic in nature, it relates sound and meaning. Secondly, language is shaped by the way it is used, in other words, the functional aspect, and also by general cognitive abilities. So general abilities at symbolization, at abstraction and so on, shape language as it is. And the third point, I'll come back to this point, I'll develop that much later in a further lecture. And the third point is that languages have to be learned. They do not develop on the back of universal grammar. This is actually another point about Chomskyan linguistics which I didn't mention. Because Chomskyan grammars are so abstract and so complicated, it is virtually impossible it would be impossible for a learner to learn those abstract grammars on the basis of data. So the Chomskyan assumption is that the basic structure of language is innate, it is inborn, it is genetically transmitted. Just as the development of bodily organs is to some extent genetically pre-programmed, right? So the emergence of language is genetically pre-programmed, and this is expressed by the theory of the universal grammar. So cognitive linguistics, as we're looking at here, tends to downplay the importance of universal grammar and put the emphasis rather on the fact that languages are learned, on the learning of languages, on the basis of data. Okay. So let's see, where are we? Okay. Now, language as a symbolic system. So some aspects of this quotation, actually, to comment on. Language makes available to the speaker for either personal or communicative use. Either personal or communicative use. That is actually rather interesting and I think perhaps significant point that Laneke makes. If you ask people, what is language for? Why do we have language? What is the function of language? Then the answer that you invariably get is, it's for communication. To communicate with other people. That's probably, well, this is obviously true, but it's not the only function of language, and perhaps not even the most important or the principal one. And here, actually, there would be some consensus between cognitive linguistics here and the Chomskyan view, actually. Chomsky himself has said on many occasions language is not for communication. Language is for the representation of thought. So the primary function of language is to enable you to think. Right? And a byproduct of that is that you can communicate your thoughts to other people. But to say that the primary, or indeed the primary central function of language is communication is possibly not true. So for personal use, that is to represent your own thoughts. Okay? But still, Laneke leaves open both possibilities for either personal or communicative use. An open-ended set of signs, open-ended, the number is not fixed, or expressions, each of which associates semantic representation of some kind with a phonological representation of some kind. Now let's see how this goes. Okay, a little later in this same book, Laneke refines this definition somewhat. The grammar of a language. Okay, he's using grammar here in a general sense to include the full description of a language, not just syntax, but the language as a whole. The grammar of a language is defined as those aspects of cognitive organization in which resides a speaker's grasp of established linguistic convention. It can be characterized as a structured inventory of conventional linguistic units. Okay, I'll come back to this in a moment. But let's pursue the idea of language as a symbolic system. It means, in fact, that there are only three kinds of objects in a language, or three kinds of things in a language. There are the phonological structures, there are sounds, or gestures, or written symbols. There are phonological structures. There are semantic structures, that is, meanings. And there are symbolic structures which relate the one to the other. So there are meanings, there are sounds, and there are symbolic relations between meanings and sounds. So only three kinds of objects. Notice there's no syntax in there. Actually, we'll come back to that in a moment. So to know a language is to know these units. Tens, hundreds of thousands, possibly, of these phonological, semantic, and symbolic units. And to learn a language is to gradually build up this inventory. And this inventory of conventional linguistic units, that is, established facts about sound, meanings, and symbolic relations, which are structured, I'll come back to this later, and your knowledge of these then makes possible the what is referred to here. Okay, now, so language consists then of the sounds, the meanings, and the symbolic relations, and the inventory is structured. What this means, develop this notion a little further. So, to know a language then is to know the inventory of conventional linguistic units, but the inventory is not simply a list of random items. It's an inventory of structured linguistic units, and it's structured by three kinds of relations between units. Okay, let's take a practical example here. Okay, if we take an example in phonology, if we take, I don't know, the word, oops, Oops. Okay, the pronunciation cat would be a phonological unit. It's a sound, right? So one of the many hundreds of thousands of units you need to know English is this phonological unit cat. But that unit is in itself complex in that you can break it down into its parts. There is the vowel, the a, vowel, the k, and the t. Now, so the idea of a k consonant, that is also a unit, phoneme, which occurs in many phonological units, and the relation between this and that is the relation of the part to the whole. So this unit and this unit are related through the part-whole relationship. Now, you can think of that also in semantic terms, the notion of a... Okay, think of that as the concept of a black cat. Okay, the concept of a black cat. There you also have a part-whole relation, namely the notion of cat, the notion of black. So the notion of black is a part of the notion of black cat. Okay? So the relation of part-whole is, of course, a very basic notion in a language, that you can break down complex expressions into their parts. Now, second one is the relation of similarity, the relation of schematicity. This is actually a very, very important notion in cognitive grammar, in cognitive linguistics. What that says basically is that if you look at the phonology, the sound here, you can say that cat is an example of, it's a syllable. It's a syllable with a certain structure, and basically, if you like, it has a structure consonant, vowel, consonant. So that is also a unit of English. The fact that you can have a syllable consisting of consonant, vowel, consonant. So if you like, that is a syllable. That is a unit of English. And the relation between that and that is simply that this is more abstract than that. This has more information than that. Here the details have been filled in. We will say that this is the schema and this is the instance. So the schema is an abstract general representation, and the instance is when you take your abstract schema and fill in the details. You fill in the information. Now, of course, this particular schema, of course, has many, many, many instances. Okay? Any English syllable, consonant, vowel, consonant, would be an instance of this schema. This in itself would be an instance of an even... That would be an instance of another schema, which is simply syllable. Now, you can have many different kinds of syllables. You can have simply CV syllables or CV, CC syllables. So syllables can have all sorts of different kinds of structures, but the notion of a syllable would be a fairly schematic unit, which can have then instances and all sorts of further instances. So, so you have then the relations, as I say, between the more abstract and the more specific. And this sort of relation between the schema and this instance, of course, can occur in the syntax, it can occur in the semantics, and so on and so forth. That, for example, you might say would be an instance of a schema which is adjective-noun, if you like. So the word cat would be an instance of noun, count noun, and so on. So this then captures the notion of the schema, then captures the notion, if you like, of the rule, the grammatical rule, the generalization. So put this in the perspective of learning English, or whatever language. Different languages, as we know, have different phonologies. different sound combinations are acceptable in some languages but not in others. I would imagine cat is not a possible syllable in Mandarin. It is a possible syllable in English. So what does that say about learning? Well, learning English, you come across things like that, and you come across other examples like that. You come across cat, hat, dog, pan, man, and so on. You come across all these sorts of examples, and from these you then form the schema, which is that is one possible type of syllable in English. So learning then proceeds from the basis of the examples that you encounter, and when you observe that two things that you encounter are similar, so cat and dog would be phonologically similar in that they are both consonant, vowel, consonant, then you get the schema. Now, so the picture of a language that emerges is then of this vast network of these units, phonological, semantic, symbolic, which are then related. Some are parts of others, some are schematic for others, and some are similar to others in various ways. So it's a vast network, which makes it look as if learning a language would be actually rather an impossible task. There's hundreds of thousands of units you've got to learn. But in fact, awareness of these relations, the fact that units in a language are related, that they are structured, in fact, has the effect of actually making a language easier to learn, because the fact that things are related reduces the arbitrariness of the inventory. So a language is not simply a list of tens, hundreds of thousands of unrelated facts. They are related to each other in various ways, and the more things are related to each other, the easier they are to learn. So something is easy to learn if you can relate it, if you can link it to all sorts of other things that you know. So the awareness of all these relations then reduces the arbitrariness of the inventory and the items in the inventory. So a linguistic unit then becomes motivated, it becomes easier to learn, it has its place in the system because of all the relations it has to other things in the system. Okay? And I say together they constitute a system of units and all their different kinds of relations. Okay. Now, another important consequence of taking the symbolic view of language seriously is that grammar, that is the syntax of a language, the grammar in the narrow sense, can also be described in terms of symbolic units which relate a form and a meaning. For example, if you take the notion of a noun, okay, what is the meaning? Well, okay, noun would be a highly schematic unit, right? Highly abstract. Does the symbolic unit noun have a meaning? Well, is there a schematic meaning of noun? Well, Lannigan argued that there is. It is simply a thing in a very abstract and a very general sense. Does it have a phonology? Well, yes. It's got to have some sound. If there was no sound, you couldn't hear it, it wouldn't be there. But the phonological representation of noun is basically so schematic as to be simply empty. Some sound. Right? As you get more specific, of course, to less schematic units, then of course you can fill in the details to some extent. But also, if you take the syntax here of adjective plus noun, so the idea of adjective plus noun itself is a symbolic unit relating some very, very schematic meaning to a very schematic phonological form. Now, I'll pursue this probably tomorrow, but we'll see. This approach actually leads to quite a radical reconceptualization of the notion of what a rule is. If you think of rules as schemas, then this leads to actually quite a novel, a radical understanding of rules. Okay, another aspect of cognitive linguistics which I want to emphasize, and this will be apparent from the comments I've made here about black cat and so on, is that cognitive linguistics is usage-based. And this is an expression which has often been used in connection with, especially Lanneker's cognitive linguistics. And it's based on usage. Now, there are actually two ways to understand this, one theoretical, the other methodological. Now, the theoretical sense would be the input to language acquisition is actual events, actual encounters with the language. So that is the input to acquisition. The input to acquisition is usage as linguistic events in all their complexity, right? In all their complexity, as encountered by the learner. So rules or generalizations are made over encountered events. It's as if some of the very specific information is filtered out and all you're left with is then the more schematic representations, the commonalities between different events. Language acquisition is then seen as a very much a sort of bottom-up, if you use that metaphor. On the basis of encounters with individual events, you then notice similarities between them, abstractions are formed, abstractions over abstractions, and so on and so forth. So the rules are generalizations over encountered events. So that is one way, well, perhaps the most important or the theoretically interesting way in which you can say that cognitive linguistics is usage-based. There is some confusion here because you can think of usage-based as referring to the actual practice of linguists themselves. Now, I mentioned earlier that one of the features of Chomskyan linguistics is that the data that they use is nearly always invented artificial examples and intuitive judgments on grammaticality and so on. Now, as a matter of fact, if you look at Lanneker's books, or even Lakoff's books, and perhaps even more, Len Talmey's publications, you'll be struck by the fact that these people also use invented data. In the early days of cognitive linguistics, people made use of invented examples. So from this point of view, their actual practice was not based on usage. And in fact, in my books, I also don't use many tested examples. I also made up my examples to make the points. So in their actual methodology, in their actual how they do their linguistic description, cognitive linguistics have not always based their analyses on attested usage, but rather made use of invented data. But I think there's a change happening, and one of the interesting developments, I think, in cognitive linguistics is the increasing importance given to the study of corpora, the corpus, the study of actual linguistic data, and the analysis of usage patterns which can be observed in large corpora. So there's a certain coming together of cognitive linguistics and what is in fact quite a well-established tradition of corpus linguistics, which is especially strong, of course, in lexicography. So this is now changing, I say, with the increasing importance attached to the study of linguistic, of large corpora, such as, for example, the British National Corpus and such like. And also I've noticed that quite a few people nowadays are basing their linguistic descriptions actually on Google. They Google for your linguistic data. Right? If you want to know whether a particular expression is possible, Google it, and you'll find out. Or if you want to know if this expression is more frequent than that expression, Google them both, and you get a pretty good indication of which is more frequent than the other. Okay, there are problems with Googling, of course, but in general, you get a pretty good idea as to what, well, a broad picture of what is possible, what is not possible, what is frequent and what is less frequent, in fact. So this is a usage-based linguistics in the purest sense, in fact. Okay. Now let me see. How much time do we have? Okay. Now, right. Now I said earlier that one of the assumptions of cognitive linguistics is that language is not an independent module of the mind, but in fact is based in general cognitive abilities. And some of these general cognitive abilities, I've made a list of some of them here, or abilities or aptitudes or whatever. Some of these I'll be talking about in further detail later on this week. The ability to categorize. Now, in fact, the ability to categorize is absolutely crucial to the notion of the schema and the instance. If we sort of the schema and two of its instances, and of course there are many, many, many more. The schema emerges because you notice the similarity between the two instances. In other words, you have categorized them as instances of the same thing. Okay? So categorization, the ability to see similarity in difference, the ability to overlook differences and to see the identity between things, that is an absolutely crucial cognitive ability. You wouldn't be able to function in the world without it, and it's absolutely crucial to language structure. So this is a general cognitive ability which is crucial to language and which is also crucial to non-linguistic activities. Second point, I'll go through these very quickly and we'll elaborate on them later. A second cognitive ability is the figure-ground organization. What that means is that if you perceive a scene, it could be visual, you don't perceive everything as of equal importance. You focus in on something which is the figure, the thing you are attending to, and then there's the background. This would apply to visual perception, it would apply to auditory perception. At the moment, hopefully, my voice is the figure, and all the background noise is the ground. People coughing and moving and so on. So you perceive in terms of the figure and the ground. You focus in on certain things, and other things are the background context for that. So that is absolutely crucial for perception. It's also absolutely crucial for linguistic structure. Well, to give a perceptual example, here you perceive the figure would be the black letters, and the ground would be the white background. You wouldn't perceive a black board with lots of white on it. You perceive white with black on it. You don't perceive black with great patches of white on it. So the actual letters are the figure and the white is the background. It's very difficult to perceive it differently, although perhaps you might be able to, but okay. But this figure-ground organization is absolutely crucial in language structure. For example, if you say, well, you know, the book on the table as opposed to the table under the book, that is a figure-ground thing. The book on the book is the figure, the table is the ground. The table under the book, you've reversed figure-ground, and that becomes sort of unusual. Right? So figure-ground organization is absolutely crucial in linguistic structure. Secondly, construal. Yeah, this actually is an aspect of figure-ground organization. We use language, if you like, to describe or to refer to a situation. But we don't use language to refer to a situation as it is, but rather to how we perceive it and how we structure it. In other words, if you have a table and the book on it, you perceive that as the book being the figure and the table being the ground. You give it some sort of mental organization. You structure it mentally that way, and you then express this linguistically by means of the expression book on the table rather than the other way around. So construal has to do with the fact that you actually structure experience, and language is used then to refer to how you construe something rather than how it actually is. Possibly it doesn't even make sense to say how things really are. It's only how you perceive things, how you construe them, how you structure them mentally. I say figure ground organization is an aspect of that. Okay, another important cognitive ability is that many of our concepts are based on actual physical bodily experience. They're not just purely mental things. Take, for example, the notion of something being heavy in weight. Right? You can't really define the notion of heavy without an understanding of what it feels like. Right? The notion of heavy is based on your physical experience of holding something which is heavy. So it's based in actual physical bodily experience. So many concepts are actually based experientially. They cannot be reduced to simply matters of other words or to sort of abstract concepts. So bodily experience, physical experience of interacting with the world, with our bodies, then becomes the basis for quite a few of our concepts and so on. Now, another important point is that what we say is actually only a very small part of what we mean. So what we say is understood in virtue of all sorts of other things going on. And I think it was Foucault who used the expression background cognition. All sorts of things are going on in the back, which enable you to understand what people are talking about. And this would involve metaphor, blending, analogy, inferencing, all these other sorts of things. Okay, we'll be talking about that later. Another important aspect of language, which is often overlooked, in fact, Lanneker speaks of the notion of entrenchment. You can see it as an aspect of a more general thing, as automatization. Namely, the more frequently you do something, the less you have to pay attention to it. It becomes automatic. Okay, we tend to think of that in terms of movement. If you're learning to play a musical instrument, initially it's incredibly difficult. You've got to pay attention to every single movement you make. After you've had a lot of practice, it becomes automatic. You don't have to pay attention to everything. No, it's an acquired skill. So through practice, repeated practice, things become automatic. You don't have to pay attention to every single component movements. You can run off a whole sequence of movements without paying attention. It's automatic. Okay? Now, speaking proficiency is also automatic. If you learn the pronunciation of a foreign language, initially it's very difficult. You have to follow the instructions, what exactly to do with your tongue and where to put it and all the rest of it. So you have to pay conscious attention to how to produce all these strange sounds. After you've been doing it for some time, it becomes automatic. You don't have to pay attention to the articulation. It becomes automatic. But the same, of course, applies not just to the activities of the actual activities, physical activities, but also to cognitive activities. If you've been if you've been following some mental process often enough, it becomes automatic. You don't have to think about it. And then the grammatical or semantic organization of a language also exhibits this phenomenon of entrenchment. If you are proficient in a language, you don't have to pay too much attention as to how to say things in the language. It becomes automatic because you've learned the routines. It's become automatic. Now, entrenchment would apply specifically to the fact that certain elements in the language occur so often that they are very deeply automated, they acquire a kind of life of their own. Or to put it another, or to give an example, if you have learned the pronunciation cat, you don't have to pay attention to the fact that there's a consonant at the end of it, whatever. It's automatic. You've acquired that particular skill. And that particular pronunciation has become entrenched. You don't have to rehearse it. Whereas if you are trying to pronounce a very rare or unusual word, then you might have to pay attention to its pronunciation because the pronunciation is not entrenched. Okay, so entrenchment, basically entrenchment is a function of frequency of use. The more frequent something is used, the more frequent it has been processed, so as something is used more frequently and is processed more frequently, it acquires a kind of automatic unit status, and you don't have to internally analyze it, and so on. Okay, and the final aspect of language, actually, which is often overlooked by linguists, this is the fact that people enjoy language. There's a certain aesthetic pleasure to it. You can see that with babies when they start babbling. They're simply producing sequences of syllables which don't mean anything. The child is not communicating anything to anybody. It's simply having fun, making noises. And this develops in adults, of course, into poetry and literature and so on. But there is the aesthetic aspect of language, that we take pleasure in language. We take pleasure in doing difficult things, actually. Most culture, probably every culture, admires gifted public speakers, public orators, public performers. So there is then the aesthetic aspect of language. That we like the sounds of certain things. So that is an aspect which is often overlooked. Okay, so those are topics which I'll be elaborating on in the course of the next few talks. Now I want to conclude actually by talking about the general terms about what cognitive linguistics can possibly offer the language teaching profession. And here these remarks are very general and very speculative. Now, come back to comments I made right at the beginning. If we agree, and I think you probably would agree, that language teaching should be based in good linguistic theory, we need to ask, what is a good linguistic theory? What are the criteria for evaluating a linguistic theory? And here actually we come back to Chomsky once again. You see there's this love-hate relation with Chomsky. Yes? So the criteria, the question of what is a good linguistic theory, Chomsky's criteria, which I would accept, would be first of all descriptive adequacy and then explanatory adequacy. A good theory has got to be descriptively adequate. That is to say, it describes what it's supposed to describe. It gives an accurate description of a language. It has to cover the facts. Exceptions and all. Generalizations have to be true to the facts of the matter. The definitions of words which are given in dictionaries are very often just wrong. And it's not difficult to find out and not difficult to notice that they are wrong. Many uses of words are simply not listed in dictionaries. Many grammatical points are simply not listed in grammars. So even for a language like English, which must be the most described language in the world, you find that the standard reference grammars are very often just wrong or inadequate. They don't meet this basic requirement of descriptive adequacy, which is that any grammatical description has to cover the facts. And this becomes serious, of course, in a pedagogical context, where you find that teaching materials contain rules which are actually wrong and misleading, which is a serious drawback of the pretty basic nature. So one criteria is descriptive adequacy. A linguistic theory has got to cover the facts, and to the extent that you make generalizations in the terms of rules and schemas, these have got to be true to the facts. Secondly, explanatory adequacy. A theory is valued to the extent that it explains the facts. Why are the facts as they are, rather than different. And one way to do this is by relating these facts to more general principles and to each other, so to show the interrelatedness, the motivation, to use the term I used earlier. Okay, I may be prejudiced, but I think cognitive linguistics succeeds on these two criteria. Now, the general question of what cognitive linguistics can offer language teaching, well, first of all, there's no quick fix to anything. The fact remains that to learn a foreign language is difficult. It takes a long time, a lot of effort, and there's no way you can do it in 6 weeks or whatever. So, cognitive linguistics emphasizes, in fact, the enormous amount of stuff that has to be learned. A language is the inventory of linguistic units. Cognitive linguistics actually emphasizes, underlines, the enormous number of these linguistic units that exist. Okay? So it emphasizes the enormous number of linguistic units that the learner has to master. So it's not a question of saying that, in English you have to learn to speak English reasonably fluently. You've got to learn 5,000 words. Okay, well, that's probably true, but there are tens and tens and hundreds of thousands of other things you've got to learn in order to be able to use those 5,000 words. So it emphasizes the enormous number of linguistic units that a learner has to master. So from one point of view, actually, cognitive linguistics emphasizes the enormity of the task, how enormous the task is. And it follows that in order to learn these hundreds of thousands of linguistic units, you need very, very extensive exposure to the language over a lengthy period of time. There is, as I say, no quick fix. You can't do it in 6 weeks. Right? So it requires a very extensive exposure to linguistic data over a very lengthy period of time. That is not controversial. I think most people would agree with that. But notice that the cognitive linguistic theory actually predicts this. The Chomskyan theory would not predict that. It would simply predict you have to learn your couple of thousand linguistic units, your half a dozen rules, and that's it, basically. Now, another consequence, I don't know whether you go in, I don't know whether this distinction is often made here in language teaching practice, the focus on form and the focus on meaning. Is that a familiar concept? Okay, that's whether you should get your learners to focus on the grammatical correctness or to focus on getting the meaning across. So focus on form, getting things grammatically accurate, and focus on meaning, communicating somehow. So it's a contrast which is very often invoked, actually, whether you should focus on form or focus on meaning. But actually, within the cognitive linguistic position, the distinction is not a real one. Given the symbolic view, to focus on form is to focus on meaning. Right? If language is symbolic, if you get the form right, you get the meaning right. If the form is wrong, well, it symbolizes the wrong meaning, since different forms symbolize different meanings. And an incorrect form is something which is not a conventionalized part of the language. So the formal structures of a language are the conventionalized means for symbolizing content. So the distinction between form and meaning actually is not valid anymore. It's not really valid. Form and meaning are simply two sides of the same coin. Now, another consequence of this, and again, this is comes as no surprise to anybody, I dare say, but cognitive linguistics reinforces, strengthens the idea, which is, I imagine, generally accepted, that the language learner needs to be exposed to material that is meaningful, that the language classroom must make use of material that is meaningful to the learners. In other words, the old days where you had pattern drills where you transformed sentences, made them passive, made them past tense or whatever, where it's simply a mechanical operation, and the meaning of these things was not at issue. This probably is a waste of time, as I think language teaching researchers have discovered. So given the symbolic nature of language, it follows that the language classroom, the language learning situation must be centered around the use of material that is meaningful to the learners. And to put it another way, the learner needs massive exposure to comprehensible input. And again, that is something which I think is not controversial. But again, cognitive linguistics actually predicts this. So there is a certain agreement between practical experience of language teachers and the theory, the cognitive linguistic theory. Now, this is something that I'm going to develop later. Cognitive linguistics offers a new perspective on what the rules are. So it offers a new perspective on rules. What are they? And do we need them? What is the nature of rules? Well, in cognitive grammar, cognitive linguistics, rules are simply generalizations over encountered instances, and often the generalizations are quite limited in scope. They don't cover everything, a small amount of data. And what becomes interesting, of course, is if you have conflicting, competing rules, competing schemas, how to account for the so-called exceptions. Now, another aspect of cognitive linguistics, again, this would come as no great surprise or no great revelation to practicing language teachers. It places great emphasis on words, on the lexicon, on vocabulary, rather than on abstract general grammar rules. So to a very large extent, learning a language is learning words and learning how to use them. On the lexicon, words, idioms, phraseologies, fixed expressions, formulas, constructions, rather than grammar as such, using grammar in a narrow sense of, very general rules. That relates to the fact that language is seen as an inventory of symbolic units. The symbolic units comprise words, phrases, expressions, formulas, idioms, and so on and so forth. Now, another important notion, which again I'll develop a little more, is, and this perhaps is possibly one of the more interesting things from a pedagogical point of view, it brings in the idea of motivation. To say that a linguistic expression is motivated, basically what that means is you're saying there is some reason why it should be as it is. It is not arbitrary. And to the extent that you can see why something is as it is, then it becomes so much easier to learn and remember. Right? If you can't see why something is as it is, it's difficult to learn, difficult to remember, you get confused. But to the extent that you can see that something is motivated, that it has its place in the system, then it becomes easier to learn. So learning will be facilitated, it becomes easier, as learners become aware of the interconnections within the system. In terms of learning grammar, for example, if you can see that there is some semantic motivation for the grammatical structure, then it becomes so much easier to learn, if you can see why it is as it is. Okay? Okay, and this is another statement of the same position. Once the study of meaning and conceptualization, once that comes to the forefront, as an intrinsic part of a language. And when you start studying the ways in which meanings are symbolized, this can help reduce the arbitrariness of syntactic structures and of word use. In one of the talks next week, I'll address the difficult issue of the use of tense and aspect in English. Aspect, especially the use of the being forms, which is a major problem, I think, for learners of most language backgrounds. If you can see how this sort of makes semantic sense, then it becomes so much easier to learn, once it makes sense. Another point is that, again, this relates also to the contrast with the Chomskyan linguistics. Chomskyan linguistics tends to focus on, as I say, the core, what is universal, what is common to all languages. But in fact, what makes languages interesting is not what is common to them all, but actually the idiosyncratic, the idiomatic, the exceptional. And it's quite natural within cognitive linguistics that you focus on, that you contrast languages and that you put the emphasis on what is unique, what is different about a particular language. So, which is, of course, of direct interest to learners. When you learn a foreign language, what makes it difficult is what is different, very often, from your native language. And the second point is there becomes, you can look at the, this actually needs a bit of explaining, what makes things unusual and exceptional. For example, what I was thinking about here, no, I'll leave that, that'll come in my talk on nouns and so on. Okay. Now, so some of this stuff will be elaborated on in future lectures. Now, the special challenge of all this, I think, will be to, and this is something I'm not an expert on and I won't be talking about, I leave that to other people, will be to incorporate somehow the insights of cognitive linguistics into a pedagogical format, into a pedagogical grammar. How the insights of cognitive linguistics can be formatted in such a way as to facilitate language learning. So, as I say, the challenge will be to explore new and novel ways of presenting cognitive linguistic insights to language learners by visualizations, appeal to metaphor and imagery and so on. And the use of suitable pedagogical materials based on proper linguistic analysis, language teachers can raise learners' awareness of the ways in which linguistic units are motivated and thereby reduce the learning task. So I'm not suggesting that I return grammar teaching in the classroom, but insights of cognitive, of language description can very plausibly be represented or incorporated into language teaching materials in a way to raise learners' awareness of the issues. That is, I think, is my final point. I started off by saying that many people would say that language teachers should teach the language, they should not teach about the language. Which is, I suppose, fair enough. But I would also like to suggest that the language classroom, or foreign language classroom, is, okay, it is certainly a place for learning the foreign language. But I think the language classroom should also be a place for learning about language. I think there's nothing wrong at all in that. And in fact, I would think learning about language, doing kind of linguistics, if you like, is an absolutely legitimate educational objective. Right? So to learn about language is just as legitimate as to learn a language in terms of an educational and pedagogical objective. So I would have no problems whatsoever with some kind of elementary cognitive linguistics or basic cognitive linguistics being a part of the foreign language curriculum, in fact, within the teaching system. Okay, and that, as I say, is my final one today for this morning. Okay, thank you for your patience.